The horse hadn't let anyone touch him in 14 months. Not the farrier. Not the vet from Guelph who'd driven 3 hours and charged $800 to stand outside the paddock fence. Not even Richard Hartwell's own daughter, who'd raised Storm from a foal and still had the scar on her left forearm from the last time she'd tried. They called him dangerous now. The word had spread through the equestrian community the way bad news always does. Quietly, thoroughly, until everyone knew. Storm, the Hartwell stallion. 17 hands of muscle and fury that had put 2 stable hands in the hospital and shattered the reputation of one of the most respected horse farms in Ontario. The morning Nadia Okonkwo arrived, there was frost on the ground. She came in a second-hand Civic with a cracked rear bumper and a duffel bag that looked like it had survived several decades. The guard at the front gate, a thick-necked man named Holt who'd worked for the Hartwells for 11 years, looked at her the way people look at a package delivered to the wrong address. "Housekeeping's around the side," he said. He didn't look up from his phone. Nadia said, "I'm here about the horse." Holt looked up then. He took in the duffel bag, the practical boots, not riding boots, just boots, the coat that was clean but old. He laughed, not cruelly, just dismissively, which is sometimes worse. "Right," he said, "around the side." She waited. She had the letter in her hand, the one from the agency, and she held it up without saying anything else. Holt read it slowly. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. The small, specific discomfort of a man realizing he has made an error he can't quite take back. He opened the gate. The Hartwell estate sat on 200 acres outside of Elora, in the kind of Ontario countryside that looks like someone painted it deliberately. Rolling fields, old maple trees, a stone farmhouse that had been added onto and renovated so many times it had become something between a manor and a museum. Caroline Hartwell had bought the property 30 years ago with her first husband's insurance settlement and her own considerable ambition. And she had built it into something real, a breeding operation with a national reputation, a training facility that sent horses to competitions across the country. And then Storm had happened, and things had become complicated. Caroline herself was waiting on the front step when Nadia's Civic pulled up. She was 71, narrow-shouldered, with white hair cut short and the particular posture of a woman who had decided decades ago that she would not apologize for taking up space. She looked at Nadia for a long moment. "You're younger than I expected," she said. "I get that a lot," Nadia said. "The agency said you trained in Edinburgh. I did my doctoral research there. 3 years. Before that, University of Guelph for my undergraduate and my first master's." Caroline's expression shifted, not warmly, exactly, but with a kind of recalibration. "They also said you'd been working for a cleaning service and for the past 2 years. "That's correct." "Why?" It was a blunt question and Nadia met it directly. "My husband died. I needed something that kept my hours flexible and my head quiet. Cleaning houses does that." Caroline was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the maple trees at the edge of the drive. In the distance, from the direction of the paddocks, there was a sound, not quite a scream, more like a warning, that made the 2 stable hands near the barn go very still. "That's him," Caroline said. She didn't say it like a woman introducing a problem. She said it like a woman introducing someone she had not stopped grieving. Nadia spent the first 2 days watching. She did not approach the paddock. She did not request a meeting with the farm's head trainer, a compact man named Fletcher Bryce, who had made it clear in their first brief exchange that he considered her presence an insult to his 20 years of experience. She did not offer opinions or ask for reports or introduce herself to Storm in any formal way. She watched from a distance. She sat on a fence post 2 paddocks over and ate an apple and watched. The stable hands thought she was useless. She heard them talking about it in the tack room when they didn't know she was nearby. Bex, who was 19 and confident in the careless way of 19-year-olds, and a quiet older man named Tom, who had been at the farm since before Storm was born. "She just sits there," Bex said. All day. Sitting, give her time, Tom said. Fletcher says she's a fraud. Says the agency sent a cleaning lady to fix a horse. Tom was quiet for a moment. Then, I've seen her watching him. She doesn't look like a fraud to me. What does she look like? Someone who's done this before. What Nadia saw in those 2 days of watching was this. Storm was not a dangerous horse. He was a traumatized one. The distinction mattered enormously, and it was one that almost everyone around him had missed. She could see it in the pattern of his movement, the way he tracked sound before he tracked motion, the way his left ear stayed pinned slightly longer than his right, the way he positioned himself in the paddock with his hindquarters toward the barn wall. These were not the behaviors of an aggressive animal. They were the behaviors of an animal that had learned at some point that proximity meant pain. She wrote all of it down in a small notebook with a green cover. Dates, times, specific observations, the kind of documentation that took patience and training and a very particular quality of attention. On the third morning, she walked to the paddock fence. She did not open the gate. She stood outside it at the far corner, and she did not look at Storm directly. She looked at the fence post to her left. She stood very still, and she breathed slowly, and she waited. Storm moved to the far side of the paddock. He stood with his body angled away from her, his head high, his nostrils wide. She stayed for 20 minutes. Then she left. She came back in the afternoon. Same corner, same fence post. 20 minutes. Fletcher Bryce watched her from the barn door with an expression that contained equal parts contempt and curiosity. When she passed him on her way back to the house, he said, without turning around, "That's not going to work." "I know," Nadia said pleasantly. "Not today." Caroline Hartwell's son arrived on a Thursday. His name was Owen Hartwell, and he was 44 years old. And he had the look of a man who had spent his life being useful in environments that valued a certain kind of authority. Broad through the shoulders, expensive haircut, the practiced ease of someone accustomed to walking into rooms and being recognized. He ran the family's investment portfolio from Toronto. He visited the farm 4 or 5 times a year, mostly to argue with his mother about selling it. He arrived in a black Range Rover and did not acknowledge Nadia when she passed him in the driveway. She was carrying a water bucket toward the paddocks. He was on his phone. He looked through her the way people look through furniture. Later, in the kitchen, she heard him talking to Caroline. The liability alone, mother. 2 workers hospitalized. The insurance company has sent 3 letters. I'm aware of the letters. And you've hired what did Holt tell me, a cleaning woman to deal with it. She has a doctorate in equine behavioral science. A pause. That doesn't make sense. No, Caroline said. I imagine it doesn't. Owen came to the paddock that afternoon. He stood at the fence with his arms crossed and watched Nadia at her corner, doing her 20 minutes of parallel presence, not looking at Storm, breathing slowly, waiting. Is something happening? Owen asked, after several minutes of silence. Yes, Nadia said. It doesn't look like anything is happening. That's because you're watching me instead of watching him. Owen turned to look at Storm. The horse was in the middle of the paddock now, not at the far wall. His head was lower than it had been on the first day. His left ear, which had been pinned for 2 days, was moving, tracking sound, yes, but without the rigid tension of a cornered animal. Owen didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, how long is this going to take? Depends on what you mean by done, Nadia said. If you mean how long until someone can lead him without incident, 3 weeks, maybe 4. If you mean how long until he's the horse he was before, that's harder. That depends on what happened to him. Owen looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time. What do you mean? What happened to him? Something happened to this horse about 14 months ago. Something that made him associate human contact with pain or fear. I need to know what it was. The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the one before. Owen's arms, which had been crossed, dropped to his sides. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not quite, but something adjacent to it. You should talk to my mother about that, he said, and he walked away. She found out from Tom. Tom had been at the farm 23 years. He was 62, quiet in the way of men who have learned that most things don't require comment, and he had loved Storm since the horse was born. He told her what he knew over 2 mugs of tea in the barn office, with the smell of hay and horses around them, and the Ontario afternoon going golden through the small window. 14 months ago, a new trainer had been brought in. Fletcher Bryce had been on medical leave, a back surgery, and the agency had sent someone to cover for 3 months. His name, Tom said carefully, was Derek Howell, and he had impeccable credentials on paper and a method that Tom described only as old school. What does that mean? Nadia said. Old school. Tom looked at his tea. It means he believed in breaking a horse's resistance instead of earning its trust. He had results. Fast ones, the kind that impress people who don't look too closely at what's underneath. And Storm. Storm pushed back. Howell pushed harder. Tom was quiet for a moment. I reported it, twice. Nobody listened. Third time, I went directly to Mrs. Hartwell. What happened? Howell was let go. Another pause, but by then the damage was done. Nadia was quiet, looking at her tea. Why hasn't anyone told the vets? The behaviorists they brought in? They were told the horse had become aggressive. Nobody thought to mention the reason why. Tom looked at her with the steady gaze of a man who had carried something heavy for a long time. You're the first person who asked. She went back to the paddock that evening. Storm was at the near fence when she arrived. Not close, not welcoming, but not at the far wall either. She stood at her corner. She didn't look at him. She let her presence settle into the paddock, like something familiar. After 12 minutes, Storm moved. He came to a point roughly 10 meters from where she stood, and he stopped, and he lowered his head. Nadia kept breathing. She kept her eyes on the fence post. She stayed absolutely still, and she felt something in her chest that she couldn't entirely name. Something that had been very tight for a long time, loosening slightly. She stayed for 40 minutes that evening. When she finally walked back to the house, Tom was standing by the barn door. He nodded at her once. She nodded back. Owen Hartwell didn't leave on Saturday as he'd planned. He told himself it was because he needed to speak to Caroline about the insurance letters, that there were documents to sign, that the drive to Toronto could wait until Sunday. These were all true things, but they were not the actual reason. The actual reason was that on Friday afternoon he had watched, from the window of his childhood bedroom, Nadia Okonkwo open the paddock gate for the first time. She had done it unhurriedly, without ceremony. She'd unlatched the gate, pushed it open, and then stepped back outside. She'd stood there for a while. Owen couldn't see her expression from this distance, and then she'd stepped through. Storm had moved away. He'd gone to the far corner, head high, and Nadia had not followed him. She had stood just inside the gate, in the near corner, and she had waited. Owen watched for 45 minutes. He didn't pick up his phone. He didn't answer the 2 emails that pinged on his laptop. He just watched. By the end of 45 minutes, Storm was 8 meters from Nadia. Not close, not calm exactly, but closer than he had been to any human in 14 months. Owen went down to the kitchen, and he poured himself a glass of water, and he stood at the kitchen window looking toward the paddock for a long time. Caroline came in behind him. She stood beside him at the window without speaking. I was wrong, Owen said, about bringing her in. I know, Caroline said. I thought it was. He stopped. I thought she was just someone you'd found to avoid making the real decision being to put him down. He didn't answer. She asked me about Derek Howell, Caroline said. Her voice was careful and quiet. I had to tell her what we knew, what we should have addressed sooner. A pause. What I should have addressed sooner. Owen set down his glass. Outside, through the window, the paddock was quiet in the afternoon light. There's something else, Caroline said. Something she doesn't know yet. Something I think she needs to know. The file was in Caroline's study, in a manila folder that had been in the bottom drawer of her desk for 8 months. She'd received it from a colleague in Edmonton, forwarded without comment, just the folder in an envelope with a sticky note that said only, "Thought you should see this." Inside was a profile. Academic, clinical, thorough. It had been written for an industry journal but never published. The title was Trauma Response Patterns in High-Performance Equines, a 5-year study. The author was Dr. Nadia Okonkwo, University of Guelph and University of Edinburgh, currently, at the time of writing, lead researcher at the Center for Animal Behavior and Welfare. The profile was 8 years old. It described, in precise and careful language, a methodology for rehabilitating horses that had experienced handler-inflicted trauma. The methodology worked in stages: parallel presence, boundary establishment, trust building through routine, physical approach protocols calibrated to the individual animal's specific trauma markers. It was, Caroline had realized when she'd read it, almost exactly what Nadia had been doing in her paddock for the past week. She brought the folder to Nadia that evening. Nadia sat with it for a long moment. She looked at the cover, at her own name in the author line, at the date. "Where did you get this?" she said. "Sent to me anonymously. I looked you up after I received it. I know who you are, Nadia. I've known since before you arrived." A pause. "I also know what happened. Your husband's accident, the leave of absence, the way things collapsed." Caroline's voice was careful and steady. "I hired you because of who you are and what you know. But I should have told you that from the beginning. I let you walk through that gate thinking you'd been hired to clean my house, and that was wrong of me." The evening light was almost gone. The paddocks were quiet outside the window. "Why didn't you just say so?" Nadia asked. "Because I was afraid you'd say no. You'd already said no to 6 institutions who tried to bring you back. I thought if you arrived as staff, if you were here and near the horse before you had time to think about whether you wanted to be." Caroline stopped. "I thought it would work. I'm not sure it was right." Nadia looked at the folder for a long time. She thought about the past 2 years, the quiet houses, the mop and bucket, the specific relief of work that asked nothing of her mind. She thought about Darnell, about the night she'd gotten the call, about the way grief had settled into her like sediment into still water. She thought about Storm, 8 meters from her hand, his head lowering for the first time in 14 months. "It worked," she said finally. "I know. I'm still sorry. Tell me one thing." Nadia looked at her. "The folder that was sent to you, the anonymous source. Do you know who sent it?" Caroline's expression was careful. "I have a suspicion. I believe it may have been your colleague at Guelph, Dr. Afolabi. He's called me twice in the past year, asking how the farm was doing." Nadia was quiet. "He misses working with you," Caroline said gently. "I think a lot of people do." Fletcher Bryce came to her on a Monday. It was early, before the stable hands arrived, and he came to the barn door while she was doing her morning observation. He stood behind her for a moment before he spoke, which she suspected was deliberate, a small territorial assertion of presence. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said. She waited. "What you're doing is working. I can see it working." He said it flatly, like a man reading from a document he didn't write. "I've been in this field for 20 years. I haven't seen a horse respond that way in that time frame before." "You've seen plenty of horses respond that way," Nadia said. "You've just mostly been working with horses that weren't traumatized, so the framework didn't need to account for it." He was quiet. "That's probably true. Howell's method gets fast results with horses that don't have an underlying cause. But when there's a trauma history, breaking resistance doesn't work. You can suppress the behavior for a while, but the fear is still there. It finds another expression." "I didn't know about Howell," Fletcher said. "Not what he was doing here. I was on leave, I know." She turned to look at him. "I'm not assigning blame. I'm telling you what I'm seeing, because you're going to be here after I leave, and you need to understand what this horse needs going forward." Something shifted in Fletcher's expression, the professional caution softening slightly into something more genuine. "You'd tell me? What you're doing? The methodology?" "Yes," Nadia said. That's part of the work. Storm was at the near fence now. He had been coming closer each day, not rushing, not performing progress, just moving incrementally toward what he was beginning to understand was safe. That morning, he had stood at 4 meters, his ears relaxed, his breathing audible in the cold air. Fletcher watched him for a long moment. "What do you think he was like?" he said. "Before, I think he was extraordinary," Nadia said. "I think he still is." On the 15th day, Nadia touched Storm for the first time. She had been standing at 2 meters, which was the closest she'd come, and she had felt the shift in the air between them. That particular quality of stillness that she had learned, years ago, to distinguish from mere absence of movement. Stillness that means I am choosing this. Stillness that means I am here. She raised her right hand very slowly, palm upward, not reaching toward him, offering. Storm looked at her hand. His nostrils moved. He took one step, not a lurch, not a shying motion, but a deliberate, considered step, and he lowered his head, and he touched his nose to her palm. It lasted 3 seconds. Then he lifted his head and moved away, unhurried, as though he had simply needed to confirm something he already suspected. Nadia stood with her hands still extended. The frost had burned off the fields. The maples at the edge of the property were beginning to show the first suggestion of spring green, weeks early, the way Ontario sometimes surprised you. Behind her, she heard the sound of the paddock gate. She turned. Owen was standing there. He was holding 2 mugs of coffee, the kind of gesture that required intention, that required someone to have thought ahead. And he looked at the space where Storm had just been, and then at her hand, and something in his face was very open. She thought, he saw it. She thought, good. He crossed the paddock and handed her one of the mugs. They stood together in the morning quiet, looking at Storm at the far end of the paddock, head down, grazing peacefully. "My mother told me about the folder," Owen said, "about who you are. I figured. I owe you an apology for how I spoke about you when I arrived. He stopped. For how I looked at you." Nadia considered this. She thought about Holt at the gate, telling her to go around the side. She thought about Fletcher in the barn door with his flat, dismissive certainty. She thought about Owen on his phone in the driveway, looking through her like furniture. She thought about all the ways a person could be rendered invisible. "You can apologize," she said, "but I need you to understand something. What you assumed about me, based on the car, the coat, the fact that I'd been cleaning houses, that's a habit of mind. An apology fixes one instance. The habit is what needs work." Owen was quiet for a moment. "That's fair. It's not about being fair," she said. "It's about what it costs. Every time someone in your position makes that assumption, there's someone in my position paying for it. Most of the time, they can't afford to say so." She said it without heat, the same way she'd said everything else. Plainly, clearly, like someone who has had this thought many times and is no longer angry about it, only firm. Owen nodded slowly. He looked at his coffee. "I hear you." Storm lifted his head from the grass. He looked at them, both of them together at the center of the paddock, and then he took 2 steps in their direction. He stopped. He watched. Owen made a small sound. "Don't move," Nadia said quietly. "Let him come to you. Does he?" "He will. Give him time." They stood still in the April morning, the 2 of them, while the horse considered. It took about 3 minutes. Then Storm walked forward, unhurried, all 17 hands of him, and he stopped 1 meter away, and he stretched his neck, and he breathed on Owen's arm. Owen didn't move. He barely seemed to breathe. "There he is," Nadia said softly. "There's the horse he was." She stayed another 3 weeks. She wrote up her full methodology in a document she left with Caroline and Fletcher both. 62 pages, detailed and clinical, and exactly the kind of thing that took years to learn how to write. She included references, protocols for the next stages of Storm's rehabilitation, contact information for 2 colleagues at Guelph who could provide support. On her second-to-last evening, Caroline came to find her in the barn. "I have a proposal," Caroline said, "and I want you to say no if the answer is no." Nadia looked at her, The Center for Animal Behavior at Guelph has been trying to establish a rural outreach program for 3 years. They have funding and no director. I spoke to Dr. Afolabi this morning. A pause. He says the position is yours if you want it. On your terms, your hours, your conditions. Nadia was quiet for a long time. The barn was warm. Storm shifted in a stall, a clean and peaceful sound. Why now, she said. Because you're ready. And because, Caroline chose her words carefully. Because I think you came here for Storm, but I think you also came here for yourself, to see if you still had it. She looked at her. You do. You never stopped having it. Grief took it and put it somewhere you couldn't find for a while, but it was always there. Nadia thought about Darnell again. She thought about how he used to say that the best thing about her was that she never stopped paying attention, that she walked into any room, any field, any paddock, any barn, and she just saw what was there without flinching, without turning away. Pay attention, he used to say. It's a gift. Don't waste it. She looked at Storm in his stall. He was watching her with the calm, steady gaze of an animal that has decided after long consideration to trust. Tell Afolabi I'll call him tomorrow, she said. Caroline smiled, not the polished, controlled smile of a woman managing a situation, but something real and quiet. Good. On her last morning, Nadia went to the paddock one final time. It was early, before anyone was up, and the light was that particular shade of gray gold that happens in Ontario in early spring when the sun isn't quite warm yet, but the world has already decided to start over. She opened the gate and walked in. Storm came to her immediately. No hesitation, no circling, no distance to negotiate. He walked straight to her and put his head against her chest, and she wrapped both arms around his neck and stood very still, breathing him in, feeling the enormous weight of him leaning into her. She stayed like that for a long time. She was crying, she realized. Quietly, without drama. The way you cry when you've been holding something for so long that setting it down feels almost like loss, even when it's relief. Storm breathed. She breathed. When she finally stepped back, he watched her walk to the gate. He watched her latch it behind her. He didn't follow the fence line in distress or pace or call after her. He stood in the center of the paddock, and he watched her go, calm and grounded and wholly himself. She drove away from Elora on a Thursday morning, with the windows down and the radio on, the flat Ontario farmland opening up around her, and she thought, Darnell would have loved him. She thought, I'm going back to work. She thought, that's enough. That's plenty. That's everything.